For most people, Labor Day is summer's last hurrah. It's the call for one final trip to the beach or a last-minute family getaway before school begins. But in 19th century North America, workers literally put their jobs on the line for a holiday to call their own. The Industrial Revolution modernized the United States and Canada during the 19th century. As people enjoyed steady employment, they compromised their rights in the workplace. Longer work hours and pay cuts were imposed. U.S. labor groups began protecting themselves by unionizing. In Canada, unions were illegal until 1872, when thousands of Ottawa laborers marched to Prime Minister John Macdonald's home. That year, Canada wiped the anti-union law from its books, and the march became an annual Canadian tradition. In 1882, Toronto labor officials invited an American union leader, Peter J. McGuire, to Toronto's labor celebrations. McGuire was so impressed that he suggested a workers' parade to New York City's Central Labor Union. He chose September 5th as the date because it filled the long void between July 4th and Thanksgiving. Coincidentally, that same year, a machinist from Paterson, New Jersey, Matthew McGuire, also proposed a laborers' celebration. On Tuesday, September 5th, 1882, thousands of New York City laborers marched from City Hall to Union Square. They gathered in Reservoir Park for an afternoon of picnics, concerts, and speeches rallying for an 8-hour workday. 2 years later, the Central Labor Union moved the parade to the first Monday in September. They also encouraged all U.S. cities to follow New York's lead and march for the working man's holiday. For many, the choice was to either spend the day at work or march without pay. That began to change when Oregon became the first state to legalize the Labor Day holiday in 1887. Other states, including New York, soon followed. It took a political disaster to put Labor Day on the national calendar. In 1894, railway workers in Pullman, Illinois went on strike to protest wage cuts. President Grover Cleveland faced pressure to end the demonstrations and sent 12,000 federal troops to break the strike. Violence erupted. 2 strikers were killed, and Cleveland's harsh methods made headlines. In an attempt to appease the nation's workers, he signed a bill to make Labor Day a federal holiday. Cleveland still lost that year's election. America's workers continued to gain power through the 1950s, when over a third of all labor forces were unionized. Labor Day had become a time to rally workers for safer conditions, fair pay, and benefits. But in the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. labor force diminished. Many factories closed. Jobs were outsourced to other countries. Today, workers still parade through blue-collar neighborhoods on Labor Day, and speeches unite the ever-dwindling labor force. But the day's true call has quieted. For now, most Americans leisurely enjoy the holiday as summer's last bow.
The factory. The machines look old-fashioned now, but these whirring, spinning, mechanical contraptions from the 1800s helped build America's future. Of course, everything changed again in 1910, when Henry Ford introduced the first power-driven assembly lines for building cars. Before that time, it took 16 hours and a lot of workers running around with car parts to build an original Model T Ford, but the assembly line workers could churn out the same car in less than half that time. This new kind of manufacturing became the standard for all kinds of industries. Trouble was, these jobs were really repetitive. They made workers function like machines. But today, there's a new kind of assembly line. Welcome to the next industrial revolution, the digital factory.
We're making a Jeep Liberty 4x4.
This is the Jeep factory in Toledo, Ohio, where robots handle the most repetitive jobs and people work alongside them. That's Keith Leiniger. He works here with his dad, Dwight, who's a supervisor. Keith studied electrical engineering in college. That prepared him to supervise a different kind of worker, robots like the ones nicknamed Jack and Jill.
This is a human-machine interface. This allows me to check up on Jack and Jill and make sure that they're working properly and not having any problems. It also allows me to operate them manually without actually entering into their work cell.
In all, there are nearly 250 robots at work here, doing jobs that people used to do. Before the recognition of Labor Day, a lot of factory owners and big employers didn't pay much attention to the safety of the people who worked for them. In the early 1900s, children were used as laborers for two main reasons. There were no strongly enforced laws against child labor, and they could be paid even less than adults. In 1910, it was easy to find school-aged kids like Furman Owens, who started working in a South Carolina mill when he was only 8. He said he and others like him didn't even know their ABCs, and that they wanted to learn, but they couldn't, because they worked all the time. Individual workers and social reformers in the 1800s and 1900s fought against child labor, dangerous working conditions, long hours, and bad wages, but they had little power, until labor unions were formed. Striking was an effective bargaining tool, but going on strike was not just a parade. It was more like a rebellion, and the situation could be terrifying and dangerous. Local and national governments treated strikes as civil unrest and often dispatched armed troops to break them up. Workers were injured and many died as they clashed with police and National Guard.
Unions worked very hard to demand legislation that brought about an end to child labor in this country. Unions over the years have fought for legislation to protect workers on the job, but also to protect the living conditions and living standards of working people.
Follows the most comprehensive effort to improve working conditions ever undertaken by any nation. The Social Security Act and the Wage and Hour Act. Both originating in the Department of Labor, established for the first time in history a decent minimum wage and security in old age. Unemployment compensation to replace the breadline, the charity handout, the dole. Maximum hours of labor. A law to outlaw child labor. And the Magna Carta of wage earners of the nation, guaranteeing all employees the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives, free from interference, restraint, or coercion.